meet you, Andy, and thank you so much for doing this interview. You are Andi Pitt from Ego Death Capital. So if you would like to introduce yourself and just tell everyone a little bit about what you do and who you are.
So I'm a founding partner at Ego Death Capital. We're a venture capital fund that invests into companies building in the Bitcoin ecosystem. So companies that are building software for Bitcoin. So what we call layer 3, or sometimes it's more the infrastructure, so layer 2.5, sometimes I call it. We have 3 general partners in the fund, so myself, Jeff Booth, and Nico Lechuga. And then we have 3 advisors who are Preston Pish, Lynn Alden, and Pablo Fernandez. We formed the fund early last year. We have 5 portfolio companies, which I can go into. And my background is in traditional finance and then tech. So I spent nearly 8 years working for Goldman Sachs before taking sabbatical, building a tech company, and then kind of forming the fund early last year.
God, that's incredible. It's a lot. God, there's so much to unpack there. So I don't really know what order to start in here, but I guess my background is in TradFi as well. So I'm quite curious as to what your journey was from TradFi to becoming orange pilled. So I'm not sure with your company in between, TribeTalk, your startup, whether that had some connection to Bitcoin and you were a Bitcoiner already, but I'd love to know what that journey was.
So I became more involved. I became a little bit involved in crypto more broadly, not Bitcoin, after I left Goldman. And that was just sort of by accident. I ended up in Berlin and Europe and meeting a lot of people who were in building crypto. This is 2018. So a lot of the kind of early Ethereum developers. And I guess I just didn't quite get it, to be honest, at that point in time. I didn't understand the Bitcoin versus crypto narrative at the time. I saw that a lot of use cases didn't really make sense to me. So I couldn't quite wrap my head around it at the time. I also had just left Goldman and really was pretty burnt out, so I needed time out. So that's sort of, I ended up taking time out, traveling, doing a bunch of different things, but had this idea about TribeTalk. TribeTalk doesn't have anything to do with Bitcoin. It doesn't have anything directly to do with Bitcoin, but it's really focused about community. And it was just seeing this problem around a lack of platform, like really great platforms which are built for communities to help communities connect. And so it was something that I had seen in my personal life that I wanted to solve. Unfortunately, I very much went about it the wrong way. I taught myself to code. I was trying to do everything myself. And then I went through an incubator program, learned a lot from that, found a co-founder, so sort of started developing it. But the pandemic hit and just some personal reasons meant that I decided not to continue pursuing that project. But I learned a huge amount through that process about sort of at least the beginning parts of the entrepreneurial journey, and what it's like to be an entrepreneur, and had always, I guess, wanted to be more in tech. At Goldman, I was doing some really interesting, innovative stuff, but it always felt like the old world. And I sort of like to be, maybe I realized over time, I like to be really at the cutting edge, the forefront of change in the world and what's new and exciting and different and really having this positive impact. And for me, that sort of ended up being Bitcoin. And I'll stop there.
Yeah, I guess I'm curious. So when did you really understand the distinction between Bitcoin and when did that become a focus for you?
Yeah, it definitely came a couple of years after that initial kind of exposure to crypto. And I know that's something a lot of people go through. And that I really understand. And sometimes I do understand, and yet sometimes I forget that to people outside Bitcoin, crypto in general, it's actually really hard to distinguish. And it isn't necessarily totally easy to get the Bitcoin versus crypto narrative. And why Bitcoin is so special. But yeah, it was a couple of years after that. And then it was really sort of talking to Jeff and Nico and the team about what is happening on Bitcoin specifically right now in the kind of inflection point we're at, where Lightning is coming to maturity. So you have scalability in Bitcoin for the first time, that there was this building, this whole layer 3 that was going to require the funding. And that was really sort of the impetus for starting the fund.
Interesting. So you said you made a mistake in the beginning as a founder by teaching yourself to code and trying to do it yourself. Can you
Yes.
unpack why you feel that that was a mistake and what you would do differently if you were doing it this time?
I actually, I should rephrase that, because I don't necessarily, I sort of have, I have a way of viewing the world, and that everything happens for a reason. And we sort of end up exactly where we're meant to be. And in a way, I wouldn't change that, because the process of learning to code for me was so valuable. It's something I'd always wanted to do. I really, really enjoyed it. I learned so much from it. And I think it sets me up really well now to understand the ecosystem that we're investing in, because it's obviously so much about code and software.
Right.
And so maybe I shouldn't say it was a mistake. I would just say that the approach of trying to do everything myself, and there's a whole bunch of reasons why I was doing that, is not the best way to set oneself up for success, to build a business. Because building a business, is particularly in a very fast moving sort of venture tech environment, is very challenging. And you really need a team around you. You really need the right people, and trying to do everything yourself just is never going to be successful.
Yeah.
And that's kind of really what we look for now in teams, in companies that we invest in.
That's fascinating. So how did you go from TribeTalk then to working in the investment space? So you kind of you did your coding, you had some experience in a startup business, and you're getting deeper and deeper into the Bitcoin space. And then how did you end up at Ego Death Capital? Like, what was that journey and that path like?
Yeah, so I had sort of put TribeTalk on ice. It may still come back. I'm really excited about the potential of Nostr, actually, and TribeTalk. It's a really amazing fit. So that's why I say, like, everything sort of happens for a reason, and it's really, really fascinating to me. So stay tuned. But what ended up, so I had known Nico. I was friends with Nico. Nico was friends with Jeff. And I guess Nico put us together. We kind of started talking and understanding about this kind of what was happening in Bitcoin and the building ecosystem. And we were sort of thinking about what to build next. And that just made complete sense to us, from passion, values, impact on the world, a gap in the space that, the space needed a big fund that was really supporting founders and providing capital and support. So sort of all of these factors just kind of happened to come together. And that was when we kind of really saw that it would make a lot of sense to found this fund together.
Yeah, definitely. I just read your Nostr article actually this morning, which is actually, I think, the best article I've read on Nostr, I'll be honest, because when it came out, or when it came out, when it kind of became a thing, I think I set my account up just before Christmas. It took me 6 hours, and I was going back and forth with the help desk there because I was so clueless about what I was doing. But a lot of the stuff that came out was just like an instruction guide. This is actually the first one I've read that really breaks down the potential. And maybe it's because you're coming at it from an investment angle, you're looking at it differently. But I really want to send this out to everybody now and be like, you really need to kind of read this and understand this. I guess you've touched on, TribeTalk as well then, but can you talk about why you're excited about Nostr? Maybe just for people who don't know what it is, give a brief explainer. And I would love to hear your thoughts on where you think this is going, because it's almost like, how the heck can we possibly predict this? But it feels like something magic has just happened.
Well, thank you very much. And I totally agree with you on everything you just said, in terms of feels like magic has just happened.
Right.
So we can think about, so if we, your listeners are probably familiar with Bitcoin. Bitcoin is a protocol for the decentralized transfer of value. It does have some informational properties. At its core, though, it's this sort of decentralized transfer of value. Whereas Nostr is a protocol for the decentralized transfer of information. And it has some similarities, I would say, to the Lightning Network, in terms of kind of, it has different, it's basically how it works is you have different relays. It's very, very simple, which is what's so incredible. And you have different relays, and then you have clients built on top. So I have like different apps basically, and each of those apps connects to a bunch of different relays to get information. So it sends and receives to various different relays. So instead of having a single database, there's kind of innumerable number of databases, and anyone can open a database at any time and send and receive that information. And so it creates this decentralization of the information that's going in and out. So if I just take the technology, okay, what does this actually mean? What potential does it have? And zoom out like 30,000, 50,000 feet, is it really has the potential to be the foundation for a new internet. So if we think about the existing internet was meant to be a decentralized, well, it was meant to enable the transfer of information easily amongst anyone. But what happened, it was captured because the databases where the data was stored was centralized. And so it meant that companies gained control over the information instead of that information being freely available to anyone. So if I think about Twitter, for instance, Facebook, it's the company Twitter that owns all of my data, that has the database of everyone's tweets. It's not open on the internet for anyone to see. And so what Nostr does is it means it's like, instead of Twitter owning the database, there's like 10, 15, 100 people who have all of that data. So if I want to see it, I can just go to one of those and grab it. And that's all freely available. And that's a huge shift. And Twitter is like the first sort of client or app that's being built, because that was for various reasons, which I can go into. But we can't limit ourselves to thinking that's what it will look like. It can really be any sort of application that can be built on top of it.
Do you know, that's so interesting, because when I've described Nostr to people, I'm like, oh, it's like social media without censorship. And that's actually the first time somebody's explained it to me differently, as in it's like an internet without censorship. And I actually hadn't thought that big and blue skies. I was just like, oh, great, communication is open and free now, yay, and people are just going to build different interfaces. So that's actually quite incredible, how you're looking at that and what that means. So I guess extrapolating from that, where do you think that could take us potentially?
It's really difficult to know. I think it's going to lead to a world which has much more value to humanity than the current world. So the current environment where you have basically internet monopolies that are built, a company like a platform, for instance, like Facebook or like Twitter or Amazon. I mean, Amazon's maybe a bit different, but so just sticking to the social for now, they create a network and then they no longer have to innovate. They're not actually providing value to a user. So now with Nostr, because it's totally decentralized, the switching cost is low, it's zero. So if anyone can just build a new client with new features. So ultimately you're going to have, it's this huge wave of innovation. It really unleashes the capability of innovation of humanity, because if anyone just has an idea for something that a problem they want to solve for themselves, something they want to build for other people, it's really, really easy for them to do that on Nostr and provide that to anyone who already is on the Nostr network. They don't have to build a whole network to do that. And so what we're seeing already is just like, there's so much building on Nostr. There's so many fascinating, exciting projects being built in a way that just is not possible in the existing system. And, we're only 3 to 4 months really in on kind of, it's been in development for a couple of years, but really traction. So I think it's really hard to predict, but one of the things that I just love is like this unleashing, this kind of opening of human creativity. So that we just have like a much richer kind of digital landscape for us.
Yeah, I agree with you. I mean, I think the biggest challenge at the moment, I think for people, is just that setting up the private key and the public key and managing it and storing it and dealing with the security. Some of the similar hurdles that one has with Bitcoin, where people are like, I might want a custodian for this, this feels a bit scary. But that's a really fascinating take you have on it. Can you talk about any of the projects that are being built? Like, are there any that are not secret that you can share?
So I can go over the key ones that are being built. And I think in Nostr in general, it's very open. It's the sort of a very collaborative, open community. It's very different maybe to tech kind of that we've seen previously. I would just say on the user experience part at the moment, it's not there. Like on any of the apps, the interface isn't good enough. The login experience, the account creation is terrible, quite frankly. But what's happening is that's just changing so fast. So for instance, there's issues with, the existing clients, but we're already speaking to entrepreneurs who have solved that. So it's like, we thought there was an issue, and then it's like, no, actually the developers know that's just not an issue anymore. So in my article,
Wow.
I don't focus too much on those. I sort of take it as a given that so much innovation is happening. For instance, even if it's someone who doesn't want to create a company or a business or an app, they might just see that there's like a code package which is missing. Maybe it's kind of the ability to really easily back up my key so I don't have to save it in a note that maybe is backed up, but it's very insecure. Someone can just write a code package that then everyone can implement. So that's, I think, the beauty of it, that it's open source. Everyone's just creating applications, whether it's a full application that I might use, or it's literally like a little code package for security or a way of interfacing. So in terms of projects, I guess the most used one right now is called Damus. So it's an iPhone application. And
that's actually pretty good. That's the one that I use. And I've tried using some of the web browser ones, but I've found none of them are as good as the iPhone one, that is Damus, which is actually, I'm in Canada. It's actually a Canadian developer, isn't it? Will Kazarin, is it?
Yeah. Yeah. So there's some more that are coming out, which I think will be really, really exciting. Personally, I love primal.net. It's has this amazing ability to view different feeds. So I can, like, the content discoverability is so much better than the existing Twitter experience. So I can see what's trending across the whole of Nostr. I can have like view Jack Dorsey's feed because all the data is open. So anyone can see, well, I mean, Twitter, I can see who Jack Dorsey follows. But this primal.net will actually display to you what Jack Dorsey's feed would look like. I can rank things by the most zapped. I can rank things by the most liked. So I can kind of like, and then it shows you the trending creators I can really easily follow. It's a really richer experience for me to find interesting stuff rather than kind of being stuck in my Twitter feed where I'm just scrolling mindlessly and have no control over what I see and how.
Yeah, it's interesting because I wonder, I mean, I suspect this is not going to happen, but it was interesting because Jack Dorsey made a comment where he said, I don't see Twitter as a competitor, I see them as a customer. I imagine that Elon Musk probably doesn't see things that way, but I know he's doing a lot of tweaks to Twitter. And I have to be honest, I'm not loving the user experience on there anymore. Not that it was ever perfect, but it just feels it feels increasingly clunky rather than positive, I guess. So there's a lot of open space now, I feel like, for competition, because like you say, you don't have to go and fetch the network. You've got the network. You just have to build a kick-ass UI. So I guess to that point, does that mean that people who are in school now studying should think about studying UI and UX as a priority because there'll be a huge demand for it?
That's a really good point. It's so interesting because I think, yes, I think that's going to be a really huge part. I think design in general, the big elephant in the room in all of these questions around what people should study and focus on is AI. So AI already for code, for instance, is going to make coding a lot easier. It's going to make a lot of the sort of lower level coding redundant, because you'll be able to basically get AI to write code for you. Already you can. ChatGPT, like GPT-4 was trained on code, so it's actually really, really good at doing that. AI may also be really good at designing user interfaces, and designing and understanding how people use things. So I think it's kind of scary in a way and also exciting, and something I think would just encourage people to really be thinking about, reading about, listening to podcasts about is AI and the impact on the world, because it's just happening so quickly. The rate of change in AI, which is often what I really look at. I look at where we are on something and then what's the trend, and AI is just moving so quickly. It's going to have such an impact on so many different jobs, industries, everything. So that's sort of what I really encourage people to think about and understand.
Where would you suggest people go to learn about it then? I mean, obviously using ChatGPT, but are there any other resources that you think are helpful if anyone wants to dive into that space?
I would say, yeah, definitely use it. Midjourney. So I use Midjourney a lot. I love it.
Same.
It's kind of crazy. Use ChatGPT, understand it. I'm actually looking into doing courses for ChatGPT. So I have a friend who did a course on how to use it, which I think is brilliant. And then in terms, I actually don't have amazing resources. there's some really good podcasts out. I listened to one on Joe Rogan recently. So that's, I would look for podcasts from like the top AI researchers, and then just talk to your friends about it as well. Like, I think it's just changing our world so quickly. I think we need to be having those conversations.
Yeah, definitely. That's really fascinating. In the investment space, then, just touching on Ego Death Capital's portfolio, you guys have invested quite rapidly in some quite interesting companies. And I did actually chat to Lisa Scott the other day, who's the founder of Synota, and I was just blown away by, oh, sorry, that's my dog barking in the background. Wanted to be a part of the podcast. But it was really fascinating just talking to her about the payment space and what their software does to revolutionize it. The scope of what that will mean and how that frees up capital for companies is just mind-blowing. When you look at your portfolio companies, can you talk a little bit about some of the ones that really excite you and why, and what is the technology that they're building that's so incredible?
Yeah, I mean, I'm very excited about all my portfolio companies. I cannot have a favorite. Nostr is great. I love the team. We love their vision. Huge potential to just free up, as you said, capital. So I think there's an estimate that the cost of payments represents 1 to 2% of US GDP, which is purely an inefficiency. And that might not sound like a lot, but when you kind of think about what that number means, and where else that could go in terms of being much better used than just dealing with a payment, is pretty incredible. And so really excited about what they're building. Love the team. You know, they have such a long experience in the NG industry, and then had seen how Bitcoin and specifically the payment rails could really be used for their company, for their industry. So I think that's something we had looked for, was companies like founding teams coming out of industries, not Bitcoiners per se. I mean, they obviously are Bitcoiners, but that's what I love about Synota. We have 4 other companies in our portfolio. So the first one we invested in was Fedi. So Fedi is creating effectively this sort of global, super easy to access community banking model for anyone around the world, based on Xiaomi and eCash. So this sort of concept from the 1990s that had just like never properly been implemented. And there's a couple of other people, but they really have this sort of leading implementation of it now. And there sort of seems to be this moment for eCash coming into the world, which makes a lot of sense. And they've built an amazing app on top of it, working with democracy activists all around the world. So really supporting people to have financial freedom, financial independence, and really this vision of supporting democracy around the world, which I think is phenomenal.
It's actually one of the biggest applications of Bitcoin that almost nobody in the Western world seems to know about, that's outside of the Bitcoin space. It's wild. You know, I love Alex Gladstein's posts when he calls people out and says, look, if you're against Bitcoin, then basically what you're trying to do is crush these people for whom it's a complete lifeline. It's just astounding how the lack of awareness around that.
Yeah, exactly. And we look at, you know, there's 2 aspects, which is people who are locked into a currency. We are locked into current, like fiat currencies without Bitcoin. And it's a form of oppression that may not be, it's not as obvious in somewhere like the US or Australia where I grew up, because the impact on our daily life is much, much less. It's, you know, humans, we're not good at seeing like things that go infinite, like very, very fast or very, very small. We're good at like seeing things in the middle. But if something is like an exponential growth, we just can't conceptualize, like 2% growth per annum. But when that compounds, that adds up so much, but humans are just not very good at conceptualizing exponentiality. In a lot of developing countries, it's so obvious. If you have inflation at like 20%, it's so obvious to you, or 20%, 50%, whatever, that you are unable to save, you're unable to build for your future, and you're effectively locked into poverty because of that, which is just like completely unfair. And it's unnecessary. I think that's what gets me, is it's unnecessary that so many people all around the world live in poverty, are unable to invest, are unable to save. It's just so unnecessary. And so anything, like I'm very passionate about international development. That was actually very much my passion and where I thought I would end up in the world. But so much of the sort of, and Alex talks about this a lot, the world's view on international development is like, I'm going to come in and tell you what to do and help you. It's like, we have no idea. Like, I have no idea how this, I can't come in and tell some African country what they should or shouldn't do. Like, how do I know? And so I love that what Fedi is doing is creating technology that people can use if they see it as adding value or useful to them. And so there's one thing on the inflation point where it's so obvious in countries. And then also just there's outright financial repression. So if you're a democracy activist or you're political in opposition, you might have your bank accounts frozen. You might be completely shut out from the financial system.
I mean, that happened in Canada. I don't even think you have to be in a developing country for that now. We've seen like, yeah, I mean, shocking that it happened, and shocking how much pushback there was from the general population that was not impacted by it. And I was saying to people, you're crazy not to be concerned about this. Apart from the fact that I heard that a lot of people stopped investing in Canada as in to found companies, because when they saw that happen, it set off alarm bells, and they were just like, that's not a jurisdiction that I feel safe building a business in. And I don't know how one validates that with numbers, but the fact that people didn't realize the sort of humanitarian and democratic implications to something like that being done with no due process, just mind-blowing.
Yeah, and yeah, I completely agree. Fortunately, we often don't look below the surface of headlines to what's actually, like, I think it's sort of a human bias that we take as given. And there are lots of studies backing this up, actually, that you are more like, you take as given what you're told unless proven otherwise. And there's this sort of natural human tendency to believe, and that's, we've needed to evolve like that, because if we never believed anything that was told us, the ability to build cohesive societal groups, cohesive tribes, would be much more difficult. So we're sort of biased to like believe what we're told, because that actually helped us to survive, because it helped us to bond with other people, which ultimately helped us. Like, that's the only way to survive, was basically in community. But unfortunately, that also has these like negative ramifications, for instance, of if we think about mainstream, media or social media or anything where we just believe messages that come out and we don't question. And we've seen that so much in the last few years in particular. And I totally agree with you. So this kind of, like Fedi is really building such, it's like this powerful technology to address at a really fundamental level some of the biggest challenges facing the world today.
Yeah, it's incredible. And so that was the first company that you guys invested in. And then can you walk me through some of the other ones and what their technology is and why it's so groundbreaking, I guess?
So I think Sonota was our second company, although I could be wrong. And then we're also invested in Breeze. So Breeze, obviously we love. The founder, Roy, is sort of one of the most experienced and respected Lightning developers, him and his team in the space. He's been working on Lightning since 2018. So it was very, very early. And we see, Lightning, the network wasn't really there. So it's taken a while for the protocol to actually get to the point where it's usable. But they're really creating this really powerful technology where historically it's been very, very difficult to program onto Lightning. So if I want to say, if I have an app and I want to just like integrate Lightning payments into that app, it's really hard. I need to hire a team of developers, of Lightning engineers. If I can even try to hire them, I mean, there's so few really experienced Lightning engineers in the world. And so what they're creating is an API or a set of code. So they basically do all of that for you. And then all you have to do is, with a single line of code, call their API, and then I can deploy onto Lightning. So it makes it really, really easy. And then from there, there's all of the other kind of aspects that would go into running Lightning that they then plug into. So node management, liquidity management, all of those things. But Breeze is sort of this sort of top level, I guess, platform for anyone to just really easily deploy Lightning with kind of a couple lines of code.
Is that a similar concept to what Lightspark, is it David Marcus's company, is doing?
Yeah, so Lightspark is doing something different. Lightspark is more is doing kind of node management. So if you want to run a Lightning node, that's what you could do through Lightspark. But you still there's all these other aspects of like Lightning that it's not basically doing for you. So it makes that one component easier, but it's not making the whole integration process easier in terms of having a wallet, having all of the other functionality that you would want. So sending and receiving payments, or integration into a variety of different payment methods, all of these types of things. So Breeze is sort of like the abstraction layer, just above, like one step above that. And then what Lightspark is doing is more similar to like an open node. So then that would like plug into potentially into Breeze.
Got it. Okay, that's interesting. So I guess I'm just sort of thinking about, so there's the kind of the mechanics of what's happening then. So Breeze are essentially facilitating, I guess, on-ramping onto Lightning. What do you see as a trend, or like where do you think this is going potentially in terms of businesses leveraging Lightning? Because the things that obviously come to mind are things like, content providers being able to have sat stream to them in real time. There's like applications which I hadn't even thought of, like Synota, which was why I thought it was so incredible, this idea that you could just de-risk that whole payment network and make things so much cheaper as well and free up capital, which I'd never even considered with the Lightning Network. So I thought that was really fascinating. But what else do you think that Lightning will facilitate, and what are you kind of seeing as potential use cases?
Yeah, I think there's so many use cases. I think anything which is currently, I think Lightning is really good for small payments. It can be micro payments. So it opens up the ability to do micro payments. And like you said, anything for streaming, there's so many use cases we haven't even thought of yet. So Nostr is a perfect example of using micro payments. So what you can do on Nostr is, rather than just liking someone's post, you can zap them. And zapping them is sending them some sats, like a tiny bit of Bitcoin. So you might send them like 30 cents worth of Bitcoin, $1, $3, $100, whatever you want, because you like really value the fact that they created this post for you, they wrote this article, whatever. That just like wasn't possible in the existing financial system, because the cost of making a payment was so high that it just would, it might be like if it's a $10 payment, maybe you're paying 2 to 3% on that or more. If it's a smaller payment, the cost of making the payment would be greater than the actual payment amount. So it's such a revolution to be able to just like that. And it creates this velocity around money that is so fast. For instance, I'm zapping people, they're zapping me. There's this whole like entire economy developing around zapping that we could not have conceived of, and just wasn't possible. It's super fun. So if you haven't zapped, you can do it with like any wallet. You just integrate it. The UI is still not great. It's still not one click, so it'll get there. So I think there's the micropayments, and it's really hard to know what that's going to open up in the world. I think that's what's so exciting about it. It's like the internet, right? It's a new technology. In 1995, we didn't know what the internet was going to look like. It's just this technology base layer, and then everyone's over time going to innovate, have new ideas. So there's the micropayments, and then there's the small payments aspect. So at the moment, Lightning is functioning. You can send payments of probably up to $1,000 on Lightning, maybe less, to have very, very high to have like no issues with that payment. And that then just solves this inefficiency for so many companies where they're paying 2 to 3%, or maybe 1% if it's a debit card, on their transactions. So that might not sound like a lot, but what's important to remember is a lot of businesses have pretty tight margins. So if a business has, say, a 5% profit margin, and they're paying 1 to 3% of their total revenue in transaction costs, that 1 to 3% represents like 20 to 50% of their entire profit. So if you're able to actually save them money on the transaction costs, you can have really, really outsized impact on their profitability. So sometimes I think it doesn't sound like a lot, but a company that has, say, $100 billion in revenue, or $1 billion, let's call it $1 billion in revenue, and $950 million in costs, or 900, say they have 10% profit margin. If you're actually like improving the revenues by 2 to 3%, you're actually improving their profit by like 20 to 30%. And that's huge. So that's sort of the other area where we think integrating where Breeze can really help companies. And I think Breeze is this other technology, in a way, they're enabling Lightning. So until now, it was so hard to build that, you know, most people don't bother integrating Lightning. And now it's so easy. So what's that going to mean? And I think when we don't really know what that will look like yet.
I have a question. I mean, I don't know if this is a bit loaded, but who would use a credit card in the near future if you could just use Lightning? Because I was thinking about this the other day. I'm writing a piece actually for my Substack because I just find the whole Lightning piece really fascinating. And I'm not technical, but I just think it's really interesting. So I kind of, for my own interest, wanted to sort of delve into it. But I was sort of thinking about this and thinking, well, all of us have had the experience where we've gone on holiday and tried to pay for something and your credit card company didn't know that you were traveling, or maybe they did know that you were traveling sometimes. And then they're like, oh, suspicious transaction, we're going to block your card. Obviously, that can't happen with the Lightning Network. So not only do you not have to onboard to a credit card company, you know, do KYC, like go through all of that headache and then risk having your credit card blocked, you know, you've just got this frictionless payment. Why on earth would you ever use a credit card again?
I think that's true. And also, I actually also see it slightly opposite is why would I use Lightning when I can just use a credit card? So I already have the credit card. It gives me credit. It gives me points, which I love because the thing is, it's charging the merchants and not charging me. And so I don't see the pain of using the credit card when I use it. It's the merchants feel the pain because they're being charged the transaction cost. And so that's kind of the challenge. And so we think that adoption will come more from merchants. The other thing is, I totally agree with you though, in terms of, I think there's more and more challenges with credit cards than there were historically. I also see one really big issue is fraud. Fraud is increasing so rapidly. And it kind of terrifies me that I don't have that, you know, someone can just somehow steal my number and then use it to pay stuff. I've had this so many times now, particularly in the last year. And it's just such a pain. I have to call the bank, you're spending hours with them. It's honestly so painful. And I'm hearing more and more stories of this actually. So I think, and then I think in general, there's a bit more concern around the whole banking sector. And so people are going to be more incentivized to hold money in Bitcoin with inflation. So I think there's more of a push that people will hold Bitcoin, and therefore when it becomes so easy to use it, then they will actually want to use it. I think one other unfortunate thing which makes it difficult is the credit score system in the US. I'm not sure how it works in the UK, but it almost forces you to use a credit card. It's like the whole system is like geared towards people having debt. And even if you don't want to use it, you sort of have to use it and pay it down every month just to build a credit score, because you then need your credit score if you want to get a home loan, which, you know, makes a lot of sense from a financial perspective. If you want to, you know, all these aspects like renting a house, all of these things you need a credit score for. And so the whole system is like geared towards having debt, which...
Yeah, I have two issues with that actually. So in principle, I think the fact that they judge your credit worthiness based on how indebted you've been, whether you've paid it down at the end of the month or not, that whole concept, you know, you could have millions in the bank, but what matters is like how much you've run up your credit card. So I just find conceptually that that's such a ridiculous thing. The other issue I have with it is just the data security and the privacy thing. I mean, there is not a week that goes by where one of these companies don't get hacked. And the fact that they are allowed to hold your data and they have basically no consequences when there's a breach, I just think is ridiculous. It's unacceptable, really. It's just unacceptable. And I think if I personally fail to self-custody, then, you know, that's my responsibility and my problem, and I suffer the consequences of it. But when I'm forced to give my data to somebody who is then custodying it and doesn't custody it correctly, and then I suffer the consequences, but they don't. I mean, that just seems to me like the worst user and customer experience just rolled into one.
Yeah, that's so true. That's a really good point. I totally agree. And that kind of ties into the fraud thing, I guess, because there have been all of these data breaches, which then enable this fraud. And I've had my data, that's how fraud has happened for me, because I actually data breaches at credit cards.
Yeah,
which is ridiculous. Like, it's
it
just
is.
really just, Yeah.
I'm curious as well. So, I mean, I guess we probably could go through all of the portfolio companies. I don't know if you want to. So we've talked about Sonota, we've talked about Breeze, we've talked about Fedi. Did you want to touch on the other two as well? Because I'm interested to understand what they're doing and what your thoughts are around them.
Yeah, I can touch on Relay really quickly. So Relay is a leading Bitcoin on-ramp in Europe. We see them as becoming much more than an on-ramp over time. We see the on-ramp as being very, very important, but over time they become a platform for a whole bunch of different services that people need on top of Bitcoin. At the moment, they're based in Switzerland, which is really, really good from a jurisdictional perspective. Love the team. They're doing really, really well and just giving people that possibility for a Bitcoin only way of building wealth and non-custodial. So direct to self-custody also just it's really, we just really like it. It just means you have direct control over your funds. You're not having trusted in a third party. Relay. So the Relay, and then the other one is Wolf, which is a lightning accelerator, which is based in New York. So any potential builders listening to this, Wolf is amazing. They've created this like a sort of accelerator / incubator for founders who are building in the Lightning space or anything kind of vaguely related to Lightning. It's an 8-week in-person in New York in this brand new building. It's amazing. Like you get to have views of the entire New York. You have amazing speakers coming in from all over. So anyway, I won't shill them too much, but really, really love that they're bringing, because it's really hard, as I learned, to be an entrepreneur. It's really, really hard. And if you haven't done it before, the learning curve is so steep. There's so many things you just like would not have thought about. So if you're in a room where you're getting all of their help, whether it's marketing, your go-to-market strategy, branding, how to think about building tech, how to think about your business model, how to think about building a team, what are the issues you face, what are the legal things, like there are so many things. Kind of going through the program, just you get help with all of that, and it really can just kickstart you in terms of building a really successful business.
Yeah, it's funny actually, because in my prior life, I was at an investment bank and I ran their accelerator program in New York. So
cool.
one of the ambitions I had with building Access Tribe, eventually, this is like a 2-3 year out ambition, but was to run an accelerator program for women in this space, just to bring more women builders into the space. And when I saw Wolf launch, I was so excited. I was like reading up on their website and like trying to understand what they were doing and how they were targeting it, because you just don't have like Bitcoin accelerator programs. So I was hunting around, like looking up online and going, who's running accelerator programs? And there's lots for like, Web3 type Ethereum blockchain, but Bitcoin specific ones are really, really thin on the ground. So it's really my hope that whether I do it or not, that we see many, many more of these proliferate, because I just think it'd be so exciting to actually kind of shepherd people in that process of building cool Bitcoin companies. It's amazing what they're doing. Really incredible.
Yeah, agree.
Yeah. You can go back and take TribeTalk through a program.
Yeah, I think it's going to be exactly. Let's see. Well, I can't really build a startup while I'm running Ego Death, but
yeah, this is true.
Yeah,
it's very true. I should have a question around sort of related to that, but not specific to it, but related. I guess, I mean, with you being a founder, you've been through the process as well. And one thing I've observed is that there are not that many women in this space yet. Both of us come from TradFi, and I have quite a frustration with this, because I feel like there is a very easy kind of on-ramp in some ways into Bitcoin if you come from TradFi, because there's some level of understanding that you have about certain things that I think lends itself very well to the Bitcoin space. So I have a bit of a frustration that there aren't as many women in there, which is basically why I'm trying to showcase more women and focusing on trying to bring more women in the space, but also why there aren't as many women building businesses. The ones that are just seem to be absolutely incredible, like they're off the chart, the stuff that they're doing, but the volume is not there. And I just wonder whether you have any thoughts as to why that might be, being in this space as an investor.
Yeah, it's a really good point. I would say Bitcoin itself is very male dominated, and then entrepreneurship is male dominated. So then if you put entrepreneurship together with Bitcoin, it's like even worse in terms of a lower number of women represented in building, and probably even in because a lot of the women who might be building in outside of the Bitcoin space in entrepreneurship more broadly, for instance, there's huge categories of female products, like products for women, that women are absolutely killing it in, whether it's makeup brands, fashion, beauty, health, lifestyle, which are more like natural. I wouldn't say natural, that's completely the wrong word. At the moment in our society, it's like what women are more interested in and maybe comes naturally given whatever. So obviously I'm like super techie, nerdy, whatever. I don't necessarily fit that category. And that doesn't, so that's like, so Bitcoin is maybe going to be an area where there are less female entrepreneurs, and maybe overall that's balanced out because there are more female entrepreneurs in other areas that are growing. And I would love to see more in this space as well.
Do you think then that technologies, for example, like Breeze, which kind of facilitate the on-ramping, will make the technical barrier to entry lower and therefore bring in more kind of creative types and more lifestyle type use cases, perhaps in the entrepreneurship space?
I hadn't thought about that. I think absolutely. I also think there's going to be more female founders on Nostr because Nostr is social. And so it's less, yeah, you're right, because I guess Bitcoin is male dominated, coding is male dominated, entrepreneurship is male dominated. So therefore put those three together and it's like very male dominated. Whereas Nostr, I've already seen a lot of female founders in Nostr that have ideas around, I won't say them, but I think that lends itself more to a more diverse group of people. It doesn't need to, like Bitcoin could have more women. I would love to see more women. I think there are more and more women, but I'm just realistic that where we're at, like there's just not that many female founders in Bitcoin. And I think there could be much quicker in Nostr. And I totally agree with you. Breeze, anything that makes the tech lift easier will enable a more diverse range of founders, whether it's diversity in gender or diversity in backgrounds and interests. It doesn't have to be people who are hardcore coders and hardcore Bitcoiners. So I'm really, really excited about anything that enables that. I think AI is also a huge enabler of non-technical founders.
Yeah, that's true. It's just quite fascinating what's happening with AI. I had a question I really wanted to ask you as well, because you see a lot of new tech and obviously a lot of like hugely innovative stuff. What is there that you would like to see being built that you're not seeing quite yet?
So we have a whole map of like different ideas we want to see built. There are some big challenges in Bitcoin that a lot of people are looking at. So for instance, stable coins on Bitcoin is a really big area that a lot of people are looking at, trying to figure out how to do it. It's really hard. So that's one area I would love to see really successful stable coins on Bitcoin. That might come through Taro, on Lightning, that might come through different ways.
Can I just ask what the reason for that is? Is that kind of Alex Gladstein's point around being able to have that on-ramp so that people who can't deal with the volatility can use it?
Yeah, I think we're pretty realistic that Bitcoin is very volatile. And so I personally, and everyone may have a different view on this, I see Bitcoin as a long-term investment. So it's really kind of something that I invest in. I'm not investing money in Bitcoin that I need to pay my rent next month, because Bitcoin could go down a lot. It could go up a lot. We just don't know. Over the long term, obviously super, super bullish, but I don't see that. It's like a 3, 5, 10-year investment horizon, depending on who you talk to. And so I need to have like US dollars for my immediate spending needs. So if I think about say someone in an African country, say Nigeria, you want your sort of next sort of call it 1 to 3 months of expenses to be saved in Naira, the local currency. And then maybe you want US dollars for the next year, and then Bitcoin or like maybe a year or two, and then Bitcoin for like your long-term kind of savings. And so, but then there's so many issues with access to the financial system. So we take it for granted that I can get a US dollar bank account. That's not possible in many countries. Even in Australia, where you have this highly volatile Australian dollar versus the cost of international imports, like things fluctuate, and actually it's useful for you to hold potentially some US dollars. So what is like the holy grail is to have a Bitcoin platform where you have really can easily switch between a USD stablecoin and Bitcoin without needing to go through the whole on-ramp process into the traditional financial system.
I see. Okay, I understand what you're saying now. Yeah, yeah,
So
that
I
makes
just
a lot
I
of
open my
sense.
app and I have like USD stablecoin, I have like or some hedged or whatever, some mechanism that I have a portion of my savings for the next year, whatever, that I am not exposed as much to the price fluctuation of Bitcoin. And then I have my Bitcoin and I can just easily like decide which one I spend. I just hit USD, I just hit Bitcoin, whatever, I can switch, I can on-ramp into either. So that's sort of where the ecosystem is going and where I like it will be, but we need people to build it to get there.
Yeah. Anything else?
I think DLCs are really interesting. So smart contracts. Now, a warning.
Can you just say
of,
what DLC stands for?
yes, discrete log contract. It's a way of doing smart contracts on the Bitcoin main chain. I think it's a really interesting space. I think there's a huge amount of innovation that's going to happen around Nostr, around ordinals, potentially. And I think consumer applications are really interesting. So yeah, there's nothing sort of specifically other than that I really have on my kind of board for this year.
Well, hopefully if any founders are listening, they might start working on that.
Yeah, but I think also what I would say to founders is like where you have a problem in your life, in your business, that's always the best place to start for coming up with a solution. So it's like scratching your own itch, people call it. I don't really like that term. But or where you have expertise or where you have, you know, something that makes you the best person in the world to build this company. And if you're potentially, and then you validate the idea, you validate the business, you talk to a bunch of people. So if that's sort of like, I think how you think as an entrepreneur is like, what can I be the best at better than anyone else in the world?
Yeah, that's a very good point. One question I also wanted to ask you just before we wrap up. I've just sort of observed that TradFi doesn't seem to understand to the full extent that I feel that they should how revolutionary Bitcoin is and the Lightning Network. There seems to be very, very little awareness of, like you say, the distinction between crypto and Bitcoin, but then also how revolutionary Bitcoin is. And speaking for myself, I remember when I was in that world, I thought I understood it quite well because there was a lot of focus on blockchain. And when I sort of exited and started actually looking into it, and it was actually Jeff Booth's book was one of the things that orange pilled me, The Price of Tomorrow. I was just blown away by the fact that this had completely passed me by. Like, why do you think that is? Like, what's your observation as to why this is kind of not on their radar to the extent that it is for us now?
Yeah, there's a bunch of things. I would say you're so brought up, trained, work in a system that it's really hard to see beyond. So I studied economics at university. You're always taught you have inflation, it's just a given. And so to actually start questioning that is, you don't do it in your day-to-day life. You don't like question why our society is the way it is. So that's one thing I would say. The second thing, I mean, there's so many points. Another aspect is this whole blockchain, not Bitcoin narrative has been really, really developed by the traditional finance system in order to basically like maintain control and basically be able to profit off blockchain, and instead of because their businesses are threatened by Bitcoin. So that blockchain, not Bitcoin narrative has really gained a lot of traction. I would say also a lot of people like feel like they missed the boat on Bitcoin, that they weren't in early, they didn't make all this money, and they like resent the fact that other people made all this money off it. I definitely had a little bit of that in 2017 when everyone else was making all this money. I was like, oh, fucking Bitcoin. You know, so I think there's definitely an aspect of that, like internal emotional resistance to it. And yeah, so I think you really have to question everything you know to be true in order to kind of get to Bitcoin. And that requires a certain open-mindedness, a certain sort of intellectual curiosity that is not necessarily encouraged in the mainstream yet.
Yeah.
Yes.
Interesting. Yeah, I've thought about that a lot since leaving TradFi. I just ponder it a lot, and I ponder why some of my friends who are still in TradFi are not nearly as excited about this as I am. I don't know about you, but I get time boxed. I get told I'm only allowed to talk about Bitcoin for an hour while we're on holiday or something.
I don't actually talk about Bitcoin with most of my non-Bitcoin friends, unless they
Really?
ask a question. Yeah, I say I'm happy to talk about it all day, every day. And I sort of like let them ask me the questions over time, or I like say something and then I say, you know, so I think that
Did that
like
evolve over
eliciting a
time?
natural, it evolved not necessarily through Bitcoin, but other, I guess, ideas I've come across that I learnt people have to get there on their own terms and in their own way and take their own path.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It was actually funny reading through Ego Death Capital's website, because I was like, gosh, this is almost a little bit spiritual. Like I've got a page up here where it says that first an awakening, then resistance to a false sense of loss, then dissolution and deconstruction, then exploration, and finally enlightenment. And then it went on. I actually studied as a yoga teacher, so this really blew my mind. It was like in both meditation and psychedelics, this is referred to as ego death. And I was like, God, this is like kind of deep for an investment page.
Yeah, but I think that's also Bitcoin. So we're not just any old VC, you know, it's a whole different thing.
Yeah, it's just quite mind-blowing to see that kind of marriage of like TradFi, economic, spirituality, investment all in one page. I actually was just reading it and rereading it because I was like, this is just really quite something special.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Andy, for your time. I can't tell you how much fun this has been. I could talk to you for hours. I've probably about 50 more questions that have come up in my mind after the original ones, but thank you. I'd love to do this again sometime. And before we drop off, can you just let people know where they can find you guys? So the URL for your website, where they can find you on Twitter. And I guess on Twitter, you maybe have your Nostr public key posted, right?
Yeah, so our website is just egodeath.capital. You can always submit, there's a submission, like contact us. You can send a form submission, which we get by email and we respond to all the time. You can see me on Twitter at @Andi Pitt, so the number 1 and then ANDIPITT. On there, I have my Nostr pub key. I'm at Andi on Nostr, Andi@primal.net, verified.
Nice.
Thank you so
Perfect.
much. It's been really
That
great
trip to
talking to
Vietnam.
you.
Yeah, same. Same to you.